Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, I am Dellia Paramitha Az-Zahra and welcome to my presentation video about memory for prose. Let's get started. What will we discuss it first? Let's know about why memory research is important. Memory makes a fundamental contribution to our everyday mental experience. Complaints of memory failure are among the most common in clinics and hospital settings, and this will continue to rise as life expectancy increases. Accordingly, a desire to improve memory and temper the anxiety associated with its loss represent a significant societal concern. Without memory, independent living can become very difficult if not impossible. Loss of memory not only means being robbed of your past, it can also be associated with problems inhabiting your imagination or contemplating the future, as well as impairing your ability to navigate effectively in the environment and even altering your perception of the world. Until we understand in much more detail precisely how memory works, effective rehabilitation for memory-impaired patients will be limited. Our aim with Memo is to provide some of this missing knowledge. What will we discuss in the memory for process material? We will discuss about the definition, stage and types of memory, levels of memory, and memory for prose itself. Okay, let's go! First, what is memory? Memory is the process of taking in information from the world around us, processing it, storing it, and later recalling that information, sometimes many years later. Human memory is often likened of that of a computer memory system or a filing cabinet. But in fact, memory is far from perfect. Most people don't remember every single thing that has happened to them. And memories are often changed and can become distorted. Memory is not just one entity. There are different types of memory, such as learning the meaning of single words, facts about the world, skills like learning to ride a bicycle, or even real-life present events or episodes from our past. Each latter type of memory forms our personal history or autobiography, which is why it is known as autobiographical memory. We in other research terms have found that autobiographical memory is very closely linked to another types of memory, spatial memory and navigation, which allow us to learn and remember how to find our way around the world. Additionally, related to both navigation and autobiographical memory is the ability to think about events that might happen in the future. One of the goals of Memo is to understand how all of these functions are related to each other. Well, next, what are examples of memories? The example of memories is one, your memory of your recent trip to Disneyland or to Dufan, and when you learned that a loved one had died, is a sad memories, and your memory of your old cell phone number, your memory of your first day at your job or your school, and your recollection of your first date with your partner. Next, we are going to stage and types of memory. Well, psychologists distinguish between three necessary stages in the learning and memory process: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is defined as the initial learning of information. Storage refers to maintaining information over time. Retrieval is the ability to access information when you need it. Then, the three types of memory. The three main forms of memory storage are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory is not consciously controlled. It allows individuals to retain impression of sensory information after the original stimulus has ceased. And we will discuss it one by one. Three stages of learning or memory process. If you meet someone for the first time at a party, you need to encode her name. For example, her name is Mutiara. Well, you associate her name with her face. Then you need to maintain the information over time. If you see her a week later, You need to recognize her face and have it serve as a cue to retrieve her name. Any successful act of remembering requires that all three stages be intact. However, two types of error can also occur. Forgetting is one type. You see the person you met at the party and you cannot recall her name. The other error is misremembering. You see someone who looks like Mutiara and call the person by the name, or you might see the real Mutiara, recognize her face, but then call her by the name of another woman you met at the party. Whenever forgetting or misremembering occurs, we can ask, at which stage in the learning or memory process was there a failure? Thus, it is often difficult to answer this question with precision. One reason for this inaccuracy is that the three stages are not as discrete as our description implies. Rather, all three stages depend on one another. How we encode information determines how it will be stored and what cues will be effective when we try to retrieve it. And two, the act of retrieval itself also changes the way information is subsequently remembered, usually aiding a later recall of the retrieved information. The central point for now is that the three stages encoding, storage, and retrieval affect one another and are inextricably bound together. Next, let's talk about encoding. When information comes into our memory system from sensory input, it needs to be changed into a form that the system can cope with, so that it can be restored. Encoding refers to the initial experience of perceiving and learning information. Psychologists often study recall by having participants study as a list of pictures or words. Encoding in this situation is fairly straightforward. However, real-life encoding is much more challenging. When you walk across the campus, for example, you encounter countless sight and sound friends passing by, people playing frisbee or Mobile Legends, music in the air. The physical and mental environments are much too rich for you to encode all that happens around you or the internal thoughts you have in response to them. So, an important first principle of encoding is that it is selective. We attend to some events in our environment and we ignore others. A second point about encoding is that it is prolific. We are always encoding the event of our lives, attending to the world, trying to understand it. Normally, this presents no problem, as our days are filled with routine occurrences, so we don't need to pay attention to everything. Next is storage. This concerns the nature of memory storage, where the information is stored, how long the memory lasts for duration, and how much can be stored at any time, and what kind of information is held. The way we store information affects the way we retrieve it. There has been a significant amount of research regarding the differences between short-term memory and long-term memory. Memories have to be restored somewhere in the brain. So in order to do so, the brain biochemically alters itself and its neural tissue. Just like you might write yourself a note to remind you of something. The brain writes a memory trace, changing its own physical composition to do so. For example, if you're trying to recall for the police who started a fight at a bar, you may not have a memory trace of who pushed whom first. However, let's say you remember that one of the guy held the door open for you. When thinking back to the start of the fight, this knowledge may unconsciously influence your memory of what happened in favor of the nice guy. Thus, memory is a construction of what you actually recall and what you believe happened. And next is retrieval. This refers to getting information out storage. If we can remember something, it may be because we are unable to retrieve it. When we are asked to retrieve something from memory, The differences between short-term memory and long-term memory become very clear. Why should retrieval be given more prominence than encoding or storage? For one thing, if information were encoded and stored but couldn't be retrieved, it would be useless. As discussed previously in this module, we can we encode and store thousands of events, conversation, sights and sound every day, creating memory traces. However, we later access only a teeny portion of what we've taken in. Most of our memories will be used in the sense of being brought back to mind consciously. This fact seems so obvious that we rarely reflect on it. All those events that happens to you in the fourth grade that seem so important then, now, many years later, you would struggle to remember even a few. You may wonder if the traces of those memories still exist in some latent form. Unfortunately, with currently available methods, it is impossible to know. Next, let's talk about types of sensory memory. It's assumed that there is a subtype of sensory memory for each of the five major senses: touch, taste, sight, hearing, and smell. However, only three of these types have been extensively studied: echoic memory, iconic memory, and haptic memory. The first is iconic memory. Sensory input to the visual system goes into iconic memory, so named because the mental representation of visual stimuli are referred to as icons. Iconic memory has a duration about 100 ms. One of the times that iconic memory is noticeable is when we see light trails. This is the phenomenon when bright lights move rapidly at night and you perceive them as forming a trail. This is the image that is represented in iconic memory. The second is echoic memory. Echoic memory is the branch of sensory memory used by the auditory system. Echoic memory is capable of holding a large amount of auditory information, but only for 3 or 4 seconds. This echoic sound is replayed in the mind for this brief amount of time immediately after the presentation of the auditory stimulus. And next is haptic memory. Haptic memory is the branch of sensory memory used by the sense of touch. Sensory receptors all over of the body detect sensation like pressure, itching, and pain, which are briefly held in haptic memory before vanishing or being transported to short-term memory. This type of memory seems to be used when assessing the necessary force for gripping and interacting with familiar objects. Haptic memory seems to decay after about 2 seconds. Evidence of haptic memory has only recently been identified, and not as much is known about its characteristic compared to iconic memory. Next, let's talk about short-term memory. Short-term memory is also known as working memory. It holds only a few items and only lasts for about 20 seconds. However, items can be removed from short-term memory to long-term memory via processes like rehearsal. An example of rehearsal is when someone gives you a phone number verbally and you say it to yourself repeatedly until you can write it down. And if someone interrupts you by asking a question, you can easily forget the number, since it is only being held in your short-term memory. Next is long-term memory. Long-term memory are all the memories we hold for periods of time longer than a few seconds. Long-term memory encompasses everything from what we learned in first grade to our old addresses what we wore to work yesterday. Long-term memory has an incredibly fast storage capacity, and some memories can last for the time they are created until we die. And last, memory for prose. Memory for prose is a complicated product of how the prose is studied, how its content is represented in memory, and how retained information is used in reconstructing the original prose. Memory for prose is a complex function of many factors. Some of the more important factors include: first, the various types of reading or learning activities a person participates in the text process. Second, specific types of prose that are remembered when the text is processed. The third, information and events that occur between the beginning of the text and sitting down to remember. And last, memory fix are scored. For example, through a memory test, short answer, multiple choice, or true or false. For each presentation, this entry considers each factor separately. But in reality, each of these factors doesn't work individually. Instead, they work together to influence memory for prose. Well, I think my presentation about memory for prose is enough. Thank you for watching. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.